Thank you. On behalf of the IGF USA Steering Committee, it is my great pleasure to welcome the FCC's General Counsel, Jonathan Sallet, to this year's IGF USA. In 2004, when the UN Secretary General first commissioned a working group to, among other matters, develop a working definition of internet governance, they came up with the development and application by governments, the private sector, and civil society in their respective roles of shared principles, norms, rules, decision-making procedures, and programs that shape the evolution and use of the internet. Importantly then, and consistent with the broad view of what internet governance reflects, regulatory policy, like other forms of government policy, was viewed as a critical component to the internet governance ecosystem. For this reason, we are particularly pleased to have the General Counsel of the FCC here today. Jonathan, in consultation with the FCC chairman, is shaping the major regulatory decisions of the day, and his background has made him uniquely qualified, and us very lucky, to fulfill this role and responsibility. I would welcome Jonathan to deliver his closing plenary remarks for this year's IGF USA.
Thank you. Thank you, Manu, for the introduction. Thank you for accommodating my schedule. It seems to me you've had a very busy schedule yourselves today, and I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to stay to hear further discussion of the conversations as they went. Obviously, the topics on which you're concentrating today are of enormous importance in the United States and around the world. I know from the report that we just heard that the international community is actively engaged in open internet issues on many fronts. And I understand there's interest not only in the United States about the proceeding that stands in front of the Federal Communications Commission today, in which we're considering the future of rules to promote and protect an open internet. I'd like to take a few minutes just to give you a sense of where we are in that process, the suggestions that have been put forth by the Commission, and the process that is going on now as we listen to comments upon them. Let's start with the reasons why Tom Wheeler, the chairman of the FCC, is committed to an open internet. He believes, we believe, that across the globe, around the world, the internet's openness has been the key to its success. That an open internet links consumers with edge providers, those companies that create online products and services, or who sell products and services through the use of networks. It links the edge providers with customers. Think of US companies that include Netflix or Google, or startups like Vimeo or Kickstarter or Etsy, companies that Chairman Wheeler and I met with just yesterday in Brooklyn. Communications that flows over broadband internet has to remain open so that consumers can get what they've paid for, namely, the ability to reach the content, products, and services of their choice. It's necessary as well so that edge providers have opportunities to challenge the biggest players, or to create new niche markets, or to launch new products and services. In the NPRM that was issued in April, and about which we are getting comments, many comments this week, the Commission described the internet and the incentives at stake in this way. It said, the internet is a collection of networks, not a single network. And that means that every broadband provider can either add to the benefits that the internet delivers to Americans by maintaining internet openness, by extending and expanding the reach of broadband networks, or can threaten those benefits by restricting consumers from the internet, by preventing edge providers from reaching consumers over robust, fast, and continuing improving networks. The Commission concluded this is a real threat, not a hypothetical one. So the chairman knows that an open internet serves as the preeminent platform in the world for innovation, competition, economic growth, and of course the free exchange of ideas. It is an engine of opportunity from which all can benefit. It must be promoted. It must be protected. The critical question, who is in charge of how consumers use the internet? The answer, those consumers themselves, those citizens, those end users. And that is what the Commission's proceeding is about. To talk about what we're doing now, though, takes would be helped by me taking a minute to talk about what happened when the Commission last considered this question. In 2010, the Commission adopted an open internet order, and it described a virtuous cycle of innovation. Here's how it works. 3 steps. First, if edge providers can reach consumers, end users, then there will be more demand for their products and services. There will be more products and services that flow to the users of the internet. If end users, if consumers can receive those products and services from edge providers, then they will demand more of the internet, of the broadband connections that they use. They will demand more and better broadband networks, wired and wireless. And third, that should lead broadband networks to build better networks, bigger networks to more people. More bandwidth, more communities. The issue the Commission identified has to do with the incentives to the broadband networks. Although their long-term interest is in providing an open connection, their short-term interest may not be. Consider a broadband provider that owns an online sports service that competes against an unaffiliated sports service. The short-term strategic incentive might be for a broadband company to give exclusive advantages to its own affiliate over the non-affiliated competitor. That would harm competition. It would leave consumers with fewer choices. This cannot be. So Chairman Wheeler believes we need now enforceable rules to guarantee an open internet. And there are not such rules in effect right now. In other words, what happened to the 2010 order was that the court, in the case entitled Verizon versus FCC, the DC Circuit, upheld one rule, a transparency rule, which is in effect, but struck down the so-called conduct rules that govern how broadband providers may treat traffic. The FCC has been at this for a long time. It was 10 years ago that then Chairman Powell first announced open internet principles. Since then, the FCC has twice tried and twice failed to enforce open internet rules. This third time has to work. It has to work quickly, the chairman believes, so that enforceable rules can be in place quickly. But as it happens, that same court decision gave the commission a blueprint. It explained how the commission could protect the virtuous cycle of innovation and achieve these decade-old open internet goals without running afoul of the problem of the 2010 order, namely that the commission treated broadband networks as common carriers. So this spring, the commission issued what's called a notice of proposed rulemaking, which asks a lot of questions and makes some proposals, all of them tentative. In other words, no decisions have yet been made. Yesterday was supposed to be the date for the first round of comments on that proposal, but given the overwhelming desire of people to file comments with us, that deadline's been extended to the end of the week. Indeed, as of today, the FCC has received over 900,000 comments on the open internet. And there are more that are going to come in. For example, there's another round of comments that can close, so-called reply comments, where the date for submission is September 10th. We continue to actively solicit all views, and we're listening to everyone. I want to say something about the number of comments that's come in. I mean, 900,000 is a lot, and that's not the end. The fact that people have taken the time to file these comments with us is a wonderful expression of the importance of democracy. It's an example of the particular strength of American democracy, I believe. It's the tradition of individual involvement that stretches back to the days of Athens and direct democracy then. The power to speak frankly to government, to advocate vigorously, to be engaged in the process of policy making. We welcome all views. We welcome the passion brought to this matter, and it demonstrates, as if there were any doubt, the critical role that the internet plays in people's lives today. So let me take a minute to talk about the subject matter of the comments, what the commission has proposed. First, let me start with the scope. The open internet proposal that's been made right now focuses on retail, mass market services, what consumers and small businesses buy when they want to reach the global internet. Although we've asked, should that scope be extended? For example, the 2010 rules treat mobile broadband differently than fixed broadband, and we ask, for example, about that. Then we turn to what should be the rules that we want to put into effect. They come in three parts. First, as I noted before, there's a disclosure rule that's in effect now, the transparency rule that was upheld by the court, that requires broadband companies to disclose how they provide broadband access to their consumers. We can make that tougher, and we can make sure it's enforced. For example, in the NPRM, we suggest that consumers need to get information on internet congestion so that they know whether they're getting the last mile capabilities, speed, latency, for example, that they've been promised. Secondly, we want to make sure that consumers get the broadband connections that they pay for, and that the broadband networks provide a level of service that fits today's internet. That's important because we do not want to let people's connections to the internet be degraded. Thirdly, we can apply a new rule to review whether openness is harmed if and when broadband networks engage in different business practices. This is the discussion known sometimes as fast lanes or paid prioritization. I know on your internet panel this morning, this was a topic of conversation. So let me state Chairman Wheeler's initial view. If priority can be given to some, say a medical device or a form of greater security, internet security, if that benefit can be conveyed without harming others, that's good. But no conduct that degrades the internet, harms consumers, or harms competition would be permissible under our proposal. There is a choice here between an ex-ante ban of new kinds of conduct versus providing everyone with guidance that's enforced by a rule. The particular phrasing of the rule, as we've suggested, is a rule of whether activity is commercially reasonable. Now, we've heard from a lot of people who want a flat ban on certain kinds of conduct, and we will continue to listen to them, and we'll continue to weigh the comments over the summer and into the fall. But let me just give a sense of what Chairman Wheeler's initial approach is. He believes that the rule, the commercially reasonable rule, can identify the most worrisome kinds of conduct, and by identifying it in advance, deter bad conduct in the future. It can put the burden on broadband companies to demonstrate why specific practices won't be harmful to the internet, and it recognizes that the internet is vibrant and dynamic. And the chairman believes the best way to do that is under what's called Section 706 of the Telecom Act of 1996. There are a lot of contrasting views. There are a lot of people who are disagreeing with this. And that's important for the reasons I've said. We take the comment process extremely seriously, and it's already made a difference. I mean, right after the court opinion came down in January, we opened up a docket to get comments, suggestions from people about what we should do then. We received a lot of comments. We met with a lot of people. And that made a difference to the notice of proposed rulemaking that was issued in May. New ideas were advanced that were included. Just to give you one example, Congressman Waxman, the ranking member on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, asked us to consider a new legal theory, and that legal theory is in the NPRM, along with ideas from edge providers, from scholars, from broadband networks, and the idea espoused by, I'm sure, thousands of the comments to us, to use what's called Title II of the Communications Act. We've asked a series of very specific questions about how that might work. So the thing that's important to remember about the way the FCC process works is we have crossed the starting line, but the starting line is not necessarily the finish line. I've sketched out the chairman's approach, but the chairman has been clear that the goal of this effort is to find the best approach to protecting and promoting an open internet. And that's what we're up to. So, the NPRM asks a series of important questions. Let me note just a couple of them. We ask, under existing law, this is one of the problems of having a lawyer speak, is that you get phrases like under existing law, which I use every once in a while in casual conversation to demonstrate I went to law school. But under existing law, is it possible to have a flat-out ban on certain practices? Would that be upheld by a court? We ask whether that can be done, and if so, what are those practices? If a flat prohibition isn't used, we asked, can certain practices be made presumptively illegal? For example, should a last-mile broadband provider have the burden of demonstrating why it ought to be able to prioritize traffic or enter into exclusive contracts? Third, how can the Commission use its legal authority to construct a minimum level of access so every consumer gets what he or she paid for? And of course, there are a lot more questions on economics, on engineering, even on legal theory. With those comments in hand, we will study and we will move forward. Now, I want to say one last thing about the importance of innovation. We all know an obvious fact, that for a mature economy like the United States, it is innovation that is the core driver of economic growth. We've seen that in our economy over the past decades. Not all of us are successful business people. I once worked in a Silicon Valley startup, and it failed almost immediately out of the box because nobody would fund us. But nonetheless, I have, as we all have, seen the power of innovation from business people who are focused on providing new forms of value from any source, from the edge or in the network. This kind of spirit is inspirational. Think of the changes in people's lives from names of U.S. companies, some of which I mentioned before, that have become iconic, like Google or Facebook or Twitter. Often, a couple of people starting out in an apartment or the proverbial garage. In fact, I heard a story yesterday from the CEO of a successful internet startup, which was a different take on the three guys in the garage. He said he had gone, I think, to brunch, Sunday brunch, in a restaurant near his home some years ago, and there was a waiter there who he had been talking to as he visited the restaurant on successive occasions. And at this one time, the waiter asked if he could come and talk to this fellow when he finished eating. And the waiter did, and he pitched him a new idea, a new business idea. And they became the founders of a new and thus far successful internet startup. That's the kind of story about American innovation that we want more of, not less. Because that's the kind of innovation that serves jobs, it rewards investors, it serves consumers. It begets more innovation, it begins a virtuous cycle of its own. In fact, to protect and promote an open internet, this virtuous cycle of innovation is at the core of Chairman Wheeler's view of what must be protected. When it works, broadband networks have the right incentives to reach more people with more networks, and that's good. When it works, new businesses have the chance to reach new consumers, and that's good. And when it works, and this comes back to what I suggest was the fundamental question, when it works, consumers are in charge. They're empowered to choose the products and services they want, to reach the content of their choice, to express the opinions they wish, to listen and be informed by the opinions they wish to receive, and to get the broadband service for which they have paid. That's what has to happen, and it has to happen before the lack of enforceable rules threatens the closure of the open internet on which we all depend. Thank you very much. If there were to be a question, as I say, I'm a lawyer, so I'm used to finishing these kinds of remarks and having nobody want to ask questions for fear they get a legal response, but should there be one or two, I'd be happy to take them before I head back. Anybody? Yes, sir?
I'm Steve Merrill from the National Academy of Sciences. And as I've listened through the discussions today of net neutrality and quality of service and privacy and security, it's recurred to me that this is a world amenable to policy experimentation. I don't mean policy that lets 1,000 flowers bloom. I mean carefully designed policy experimentation. My impression is that spectrum allocation is being approached in that manner, and I wonder if some of these other issues could be.
Let me give you the example of what where we are trying to use experimentation. I think it's important, and we appreciate the chance, more suggestions. As you know, there's big changes going on that are being planned for the nation's copper networks. There are fewer people using the copper networks than in the past, but they are an important mechanism of communication. Some of the companies that operate copper networks would like to move from copper, so-called TDM service, to all IP. Sometimes from copper to fiber, sometimes to wireless, but in any event, to retire the copper networks. AT&T came to us with the idea that they'd like to try this in a couple of places in the country. And the Commission adopted an order in January, a so-called tech transitions order, which said we welcome experiments. We welcome experiments, I think, for the reasons you suggest. We welcome them because we want to figure out what the impact on consumers is, but there's a lot of variables, there's lots of unknowns. So rather than being presented with a lot of legal argument on paper when the request to retire the networks come in and they require FCC approval, let's do some real kinds of experiments around the country to see what the impact is. AT&T is in the process of bringing such a formal proposal to us. They've already outlined publicly what they want to do. At our last meeting, we voted $100 million in rural broadband experiments, right? There are a lot of conceptions about the extent to which broadband can be brought to sparsely populated communities, but we don't know if the conventional wisdom is right. And yet it's critical to the goal of having all Americans receive broadband. So we've set up something that was consciously established as experiments, not only to see what could happen in one community, not only to try to see if one community could establish best practices that might be valuable to others, but also so that as we as regulators go forward, we know more about what actually works, right? The word learning is not usually associated with government. We don't think of government as having to learn. We don't think of it as a conscious learner. But we've tried in this way in particular, this is the best example, and look, we'd welcome suggestions of how to do it in this context or others. We've tried consciously to understand that in an age of dynamic innovation, this kind of learning, we hope will be very valuable to us, and we want to very intentionally foster. So that's it. One more, if there's one more. Is there somebody over here now? I'm sorry, sir. I thought I saw you, but I didn't.
So this morning, one of the, I guess, points that they keep coming back to was the fast lane and slow lane, of course. And the example you gave, sir, was medical devices. So I could see that that would be a very difficult argument to make. Medical devices should go first, everything else goes second. But if you've been to Moscow, you know that there are taxi services that run ambulances through the streets of the city, and if you pay, costs several times a regular taxi, they will ambulance you through the city. So my concern is, where does it stop?
So it seems to, the initial view is this. It's what an economist, I hope there are no economists in the room, might call the Pareto frontier. In other words, if it's possible to provide a benefit without degrading everybody else, the chairman's view is we should be open to that possibility. But the line is, are people being degraded? Is their service being degraded? When the ambulance goes through the streets of Moscow in the example you describe, one presumes that other people are being held up. The chairman has made plain that he will oppose any kind of form of paid prioritization that has effect of degrading other people. He wants to be open to the possibility that there are some that could provide benefits without that harm, but to him, the sharp line is harm. Harm to consumers, harm to an open internet, harm to competition. Where that appears, he believes practices should not be allowed. Okay. Thank you very much.